right. So my name is Heather Levy. I am an avian biologist at Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy. And like Deborah said, we're just north of Tallahassee, kind of near the Florida-Georgia borderline. I'm also on the board of my local Audubon chapter, which is Apalachee Audubon. And I've been working with black rails now for a couple of years, and I just love talking about them. I think they're one of the most unique species that we have in North America. And I've been very fortunate to be working on this larger Gulf Coast project with them since 2020. And so today I will be going over some of the sort of general ecology of eastern black rails, but also about how we are answering some of the unknown questions about some of their ecology. Before I jump in, I always like to describe what a black rail looks like to those of you who may not be familiar with it. So black rails are really, really small, about 30 grams on average. So think of kind of like a chunky sparrow, but with long rail-like legs and long toes. They're generally pretty dark overall, but they have this super bright red eye, this chestnut or rufous nape, and then dark wings with white spots on them or speckling that someone once said to me looked like a constellation, and I loved that, so I stole it. So it kind of looks like a constellation on their back of their wings. So I don't know what you were picturing, but this is what a black rail looks like. They're very, very unique looking, and I think that they sound pretty distinct from other rails too. So this is their most ubiquitous and well-known call that they give in the breeding season, known as the kikidu call or the kick-kick-cur call. So the black rail is considered to literally be the most secretive bird species in North America. And because of that, because they're so cryptic, most birders who do have the black rail on their life list has it because they probably heard that call. It's extremely difficult to see them because of their cryptic nature. And I'll get into all of that in just a minute here. So just to give an overview of what I'll be talking about, first I'll talk about the different subspecies of black rails and the ranges. I'll go over some of their general ecology, their current conservation status, and threats that they face. Then I'll jump into the project that I've been working on and how that feeds into their conservation. And then lastly, because I'm sure most of you are birders, how you can find a black rail in an ethical manner. And so where do eastern black rails occur, and what's the significance of this subspecies? So the eastern black rail is one of 5 subspecies of black rail, 2 of which occur in North America. The other 3 are limited to Peru and Chile in South America. So the California black rail, as its name would indicate, occurs mainly in California, but also south to northwestern Baja California in Mexico, and inland to the lower Colorado River of western Arizona and northwestern Sonora. The eastern black rail, which is going to be the focus of today, occurs along the Atlantic coast from New Jersey south to Florida, throughout central Florida, and then along the Gulf Coast down to southern Texas. There are also a few isolated populations in Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Currently, Florida and Texas present strongholds for the subspecies. They are federally threatened under the Endangered Species Act as of 2020, granting them special protections across their range. The California subspecies, although it's not doing great, is not currently federally listed. The eastern black rail is doing a bit more poorly than its California counterpart. So let's dive into a bit of the unique ecology of this species. So compared to many other of our North American birds, including several of our other secretive rail species, many aspects of its ecology are really poorly known. But given its recent status listing, which I'll talk more about in just a minute, that listing has provided additional resources and an emphasis on trying to better understand and conserve this imperiled species. So diving into the behaviors here, eastern black rails are partially migratory, meaning that some of the population migrates and some are year-round residents here in Florida. So population from those inland states like Colorado, and also likely from the northern portion along the Atlantic coast, migrate south in the Gulf Coast and into Florida. So from a historic tower kill study that actually happened on tall timbers back in the 1950s, we learned from a couple of these specimens that the spring migratory period extends approximately from mid-March to early May, and fall migration extends from early September to early November. There's really very little known, though, about migratory behavior, the proportion of birds that are migrants versus year-round residents here in the state, and whether there's any sort of migratory connectivity with where birds are traveling to. They are extremely cryptic. They tend to avoid flying and act more like mice underneath this dense marsh vegetation. We have volunteers that help us on our surveys, and I tell them literally, if something looks like a mouse, it could be a black rail, so we'll investigate it. They rarely fly during the breeding season, especially, but if you're lucky enough to see one in flight, like in this photo here, you'll notice that they hold their body kind of at an angle and always have their feet dangling. And they don't look like the strongest flyers when they fly. It's kind of this funny sort of undulating wing flap that they have. In most parts of the range, they are crepuscular, meaning that they are active really early in the morning near sunrise or later in the evening near sunset. In some other areas, they may call mainly later in the night or sometimes during the entire day. And that all just kind of depends on the ambient noise of the area. So sometimes if frogs are calling really loudly at night, they don't want to compete with those frogs, so they'll wait for the frogs to stop. They're not super, super loud birds, and they don't want to put energy out when they don't need to. And so their vocalization rates really do depend on sort of what the soundscape is around them. Generally, these birds have pretty small home ranges of just a couple acres in the winter and in the breeding season, with a couple of exceptions of individuals having larger territories. In some areas, they also have the sort of density dependence, which where the territories are really small, and that's probably because there's not a lot of high quality habitat around them, and so they have to really congregate into small areas. Males are very territorial during the breeding season and will charge at other intruding males with sort of these rattling open wings and an open bill, making really threatening growl and hissing sounds. And I would love to see that so badly. I've not witnessed that myself, but I think that would just be so cool, this 30-gram bird just getting so mad and attacking another male. And unfortunately, they can make pretty easy prey when they're exposed from their hideaways due to things like extreme flooding that brings them out of that dense canopy cover. Things like great blue herons, great egrets, fish crows, raccoons, foxes, and probably even feral cats will eat a black rail if it's easy to and around. And so where exactly are these birds and what habitat are they using? And so black rails use a variety of saltwater and freshwater marshes, including coastal high marsh, shallow freshwater marshes, wet meadows, and even flooded grassy vegetation. So I kind of like to refer to them as being marsh generalists that have specific feature requirements in regards to the vegetation structure and composition. In fact, that structure of the vegetation is more important than what actual species are present there. And additionally, black rails are pretty picky about their water levels and require higher and drier ground that isn't too far away from areas that get shallowly flooded. So if you look from our perspective at a sort of densely vegetated marsh, it looks really thick and difficult to walk through. And I can attest that that is true. It is very difficult and thick to walk through. But if you sort of crouch on the ground and parse apart the vegetation, you'll start to see how it's structured in this way that it's dominated by these clumpy grasses that eventually form a bunch and kind of branch out. And so this creates little, what they actually call railways or tunnels that the black rails then use to move easily through an area. And of course, because they spend so much time on the ground, they need to have these areas that are open in that understory and allow for them to travel. As far as the specific type of vegetation goes, they really do use a large variety of fine-stemmed emergent plants, different species of rushes, excuse me, grasses, and sedges. So for the eastern black rail that occurs on the coast, this primarily consists of areas that are dominated by cordgrass species like sand cordgrass, salt meadow cordgrass, and Gulf cordgrass. And this is often interspersed with different species of saltwort and glasswort, as well as black needle rush and saltay. And these thicker grasses form those tunnels that the birds need to move, while also supplying a thick overstory that protects them from aerial predators. Black rails are tolerant of kind of a small degree of woody vegetation, shrubs like saltbush and wax myrtle, but they'll really quickly leave an area once it becomes a more dominant component and loses that nice herbaceous openness. So despite being marsh dependent, black rails really don't like getting their feet wet. In fact, they only tolerate pretty much a couple of centimeters of water. This aerial photo is actually from one of the sites that we work on where we do have rails, and depicts an impoundment that was treated with moist soil management back in the 1950s. And it creates this series of ridges and swells that kind of resembles an agricultural field. This is really ideal because it provides high and dry areas for the birds to nest in and roost in, while also providing these wetter areas for foraging. So the buzzword or the hot term in the black rail world is microtopography. And that's really getting at those minuscule topographic requirements that creates optimal black rail habitat. So the majority of records of eastern black rails occurs from coastal sites, where they're typically using that tidal high marsh or impounded wetlands that are managed to mimic high marsh sites or coastal prairies. So the high marsh is this irregularly flooded zone that is nestled between the low marsh and the uplands. The low marsh is flooded daily by high tides, but the high marsh is typically only wet during really large tidal events like king and spring tides or really heavy rainfall. And in Florida, the high marsh often occurs as this sort of narrow strip along the coast between that low marsh and the uplands. The high marsh, unfortunately, kind of faces threats from both sides of it. And so on one end, sea level rise is pushing more and more open water into the low marsh. And then in turn, the low marsh is migrating up into the high marsh. Because the high marsh is often unable to migrate, it is often just lost or creates this sort of unideal transition zone. And then on the other end, from the uplands, too much woody vegetation can start to overtake the high marsh, causing it to become unsuitable for black rails, and also causing it to become that sort of undesirable transition zone. And I want to talk a little bit about fire. So most of us in Florida are probably familiar with prescribed fire. Our state is one of the leaders in terms of implementing prescribed fire on much of our both public and private lands. And we use prescribed fire as a tool to mimic natural disturbances. So long before development and sort of habitat fragmentation, fire is burned all across the state, on average between every 2 and 5 years. Of course, there are a couple of exceptions for really, really wet areas like the Everglades and Lake Okeechobee that have those longer fire return intervals. So coincidentally, Florida is also considered the lightning strike capital of the United States. And so historically, in April and May, when lightning storms would really pick up, it would ignite fires. And without impediments from human encroachment, these fires would burn for miles and miles. Thus, most of our Florida habitats and animals actually evolved with fire and require it to reduce hardwood, encourage production of wildlife food plants, promote seasonal growth of native vegetation, and also to reduce the risk of wildfires that are happening rampantly out west. In addition, because many species are actually adapted to prescribed fire, it benefits many imperiled species. So many of you are probably, if you're familiar with fire, know about it from seeing burns in the piney woods, but the marshes too actually require burns to prevent woody encroachment from the uplands. So additionally, because March vegetation grows really quickly, it often becomes so thick that it will really start to layer on top of itself and become so heavy that it collapses in on itself. And this destroys those railways and makes it nearly impossible for birds to move through. And so conducting regular prescribed fire in your high marshes removes that thick duff layer, that composing dead vegetation, and prevents woody encroachment, which allows for rails to continue to have those little runways and for it to continue to maintain its really open and herbaceous state. The interval of this varies pretty widely across region, also across marsh type, and even from site to site. And we'll get into intervals in a little bit here. We've talked a little bit about the fact that black rails need some shallow water to forage, but what are they eating? So this is another aspect that we don't know a lot about. From a couple of specimens, we know that black rails feed primarily on smaller aquatic and terrestrial invertebrates, in addition to seeds. So this includes things like snails, insects, seeds from bulrush and cattails, grasshoppers, ants, earwigs, and spiders. But again, this is only from a handful of specimens. So this is definitely a big knowledge gap. And it's an area of priority to understand how black rails fit within the food chain and the energetic system of marshes. So I feel like I'm a broken record here, but the breeding ecology of black rails is another pretty poorly understood aspect. Thankfully, we have some really dedicated folks in the black rail community who are working really, really hard to unravel some of those secrets as well. And so some of you who are really avid birders or are in sort of the scientific world might be familiar with the little chart on the left. And so this depicts an annual cycle for a bird. This one is for black rails. And so the lighter blue wheel in the interior indicates molt, where that top line denotes primary molt and the bottom line denotes the body molt. Breeding is indicated in the middle there by that medium blue. And that top line is when birds have young, and the bottom line is when birds have eggs. Migration is denoted in the outermost dark blue line, or sorry, dark blue circle. And then throughout the chart, the thicker lines depict peak activity and the thin lines show off-peak activity. The main reason I'm showing you this is to point out that everything has a question mark on it because we just don't know a lot about their breeding ecology. They're very, very difficult to look for. And now because of the status listing, there's definitely a fear of going out and trampling nests or overly disturbing birds. But we do really need to find out this information to kind of piece the puzzle together on the entire ecology of this bird. And so from a couple of studies, we do know that both sexes do share incubation duties, which suggests a monogamous mating system. And both sexes will care for the chicks after they hatch, which is pretty interesting to me. And so as far as timing goes, in the Everglades, black rails will start breeding as early as February and in South Florida. But in the Panhandle where I'm at, birds typically don't start until later in March, with most of the egg laying occurring in later April until kind of early to mid-July. And so the nest is this defined bowl with a canopy of living or dead vegetation woven over the top. The nest is placed over moist soil or really shallow water. And this is typically in areas of higher elevation than the surrounding habitat to try and prevent nest flooding. So most are placed in some sort of clump forming grass like black needle rush or cattail, bulrush, or cordgrass like those species I mentioned earlier. So a project partner of ours, Christy Hand with South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, she has done some amazing work looking at the breeding ecology of eastern black rails in her home state using camera traps. And so she and her crew have sorted through quite literally millions of photos to determine what sort of brood size they have in incubation and fledging. And I just put the title to this paper on the top there if anybody's interested in looking it up later. It's really awesome, and to see all the camera trap photos is really cool too. She's one of the first ones to actually document courtship behaviors, and that included offering food. So both the males and the females would actually offer each other food, which is really interesting to me. Allopreening, in which birds will preen their prospective mate, and an actual physical pursuit of when a male black rails chasing the females. And so from this study, we learned that black rails typically have between 1 and 7 chicks. The incubation day is 26 days after that first egg is laid, and fledging occurs 40 days after hatching. We don't really know much about what happens after this in terms of dispersal or sort of winter aggregations, but that's something I'm hoping to investigate later on. Unfortunately, black rails are not doing too well. So the historic range of the eastern black rail has really declined precipitously over the past 20 or so years, resulting in a range contraction and complete extirpation from some areas, especially in the Northeast and in those inland populations. So the map on the left shows breeding distribution from 1836 to 2016, and the map on the right shows that distribution after 2010. So there's a couple of years of overlap in there, but it's pretty obvious that the black rail has really blinked out from a lot of these counties, resulting in an overall decline of 70% across the range and more in some specific areas. As a result, the United States Fish and Wildlife declared them as threatened under the Endangered Species Act back in 2020, which I mentioned before, warrants some additional protections, but really importantly, also additional funding resources to better understand their ecology and beneficial management tools. So there are a number of reasons that black rails are declining so rapidly. The Atlantic Coast Joint Venture is a regional partnership that collaborates to restore and sustain native bird populations and habitats throughout the region. And so one of their focal species is the eastern black rail. And back in 2020, they released this really detailed and awesome conservation plan that same year that the bird was federally listed. I won't read through everything on this table, but the one thing that's really important to note is that besides sort of general wetland habitat loss, climate change is the largest driver for many of these threats, including loss of habitat and nest flooding from sea level rise, loss of habitat quality due to increased temperature and drought, and direct mortality and nest loss from storms and flooding. So climate change is not only driving sea level rise that's directly threatening the habitat, but is also increasing the intensity and the severity of storms that are impacting the habitat, but causing direct mortality to the birds. And there are also additional threats from things like land use conversion, agriculture, and of course, encroaching development. And the issue I really want to focus on here is marsh burning inconsistent with species needs. And so to introduce the project that I've been working on that's been gaining pretty invaluable information along the species range in the Gulf Coast is the NOAA Firebird Project. And so it's got a much longer, more complex name, but it's been nicknamed Firebird. And so this is a NOAA Restore Science project that really has a goal of better understanding the distribution and abundance of black rails, yellow rails, and mottled ducks in high marshes along the Gulf Coast. In the panhandle here, we actually do not get breeding mottled ducks. So we're really just focused on the black and yellow rails. And we do work with black rails year round and then work with yellow rails just in the winter because they are migratory and they don't breed here. The crux of all of this is to focus on understanding how prescribed fire is affecting these species. So there are a lot of components of this project with over 30 project partners. One really unique aspect of it is habitat mapping. And so some of our partners from the United States Geological Service have actually created and released a spatial layer that identifies high marsh habitat. So this is a tool that could be used to identify potential black rail habitat for future surveys or targeted management, and potentially to even map high marsh migration over time. Another exciting outcome of this project is an adaptive management tool that is in production so that researchers and managers can actually input different probability values and different assignments of the sort of management that they're doing and the different species that are present into this network that essentially pops out on the end saying, this is the percentage that a black rail is occupying that area. And so this can help us to target areas that have high occupancy and to change management schemes in areas with low occupancy to see if we can increase occupancy. So the part that I'm involved with is the field component. So we are doing work both in the breeding season and the non-breeding season to survey for black rails in parts of Big Bend and the Panhandle. So during the breeding season, we use what is called call broadcast survey. And we have 115 points across a 5-county area. And we visit each of those 115 points 6 times between mid-March and the end of July. So it's really no small feat to conduct almost 700 of these points every single summer. Essentially what we do is we head into the marsh with a speaker that's loaded up with black rail calls. We know if black rails are responding, estimate the number, and also estimate where those birds are calling from, so then we can go back out into the area and assess the vegetation there. We're also supplementing these surveys with a pretty cool tool called Autonomous Recording Units, or ARUs. These are the self-contained recording devices that can be left out in the marsh for weeks at a time, and they can be set to record continuously over a 24-hour period or only during selected hours. And so they're really, really useful for species that are hard to detect and that don't vocalize frequently. And they're also really good to put out in remote areas that it's difficult for us to travel to 6 times throughout that season. The caveat here is that, of course, you don't have as much of a spatial coverage as you do if you have humans traveling out on foot, because you'd either need a ton of ARUs or you'd need to move them around on the landscape really frequently. They often don't have the hearing capacity that we do either. So there's a slight limitation there that humans do indeed hear better than ARUs. Regardless, they're becoming a very popular monitoring tool and are really, really a useful tool that I have a lot of hope for. And so to assess this acoustic data, instead of listening to tens of thousands of hours by ear, we have partnered with the Center for Conservation and Bioacoustics at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And this is the same lab that developed the app BirdNet that's publicly available, that some of you might be familiar with. We actually use the same machine learning algorithm that the BirdNet app uses, and we send our data to Cornell, we pay them a fee, they run it through their machine learning algorithm, and unfortunately, it's not like a magic wand where we get back timestamps of black rail here, 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 here. We get back a bunch of text files that identify 3-second little snippets in our recordings that they then assign a probability value to. And so it does require a degree of manual review to go back and listen to these files to ensure that the little snippets that they picked out are actually black rails. We found that it did very well, actually, and most snippets that it said was likely a black rail with scores of sort of 70% or higher were black rails, and ones that were scored really low were typically not black rails. So it's not a perfect system, but it's a really, really great system and is way better than me having to sit down at a computer and listen to tens of thousands of hours of Marsh audio. And so the winter work is my favorite because that's when we're actually capturing rails. It's definitely an interesting sight to see us doing our surveys. A group of 4 to 8 of us walk out into the marsh with this neon pink 15-meter long rope outfitted with bottles that contain jingly cat toys. And so we walk transects up and down the marsh at night and shift the bottles back and forth to create a lot of noise. The noise flushes up the rails, and when they're in a safe position for us to capture them, we put a handheld net over them. Once in hand, we determine their age and their sex. We take some measurements like the weight, the wing chord, the length of the tarsus, and we also give them a single band with a unique number on them. So should that bird ever be captured again, we'll know something about its movement and perhaps even its minimum age. So site fidelity is pretty low for these guys, at least across the winter years. And so it's pretty unlikely to recap birds across multiple years. However, we did have finally one recap of a bird this year that was banded last year, and that's one of only a handful. So that was really, really exciting to see. When we have birds in hand, we also do take a feather from the wing, and researchers on our project are going to analyze these feathers through a process that is above my pay grade called stable isotope analysis. And that lets us know where those birds came from. So that'll help us get a better sense of what portion of our birds are migratory versus year-round, in addition to what states they're traveling from to be residing here in the wintertime. And we're also collecting a fecal sample non-invasively. When we first capture them, we put them in a little paper bag and we sit them in there for about 2 minutes before we take them out to band them. If they gave us a fecal sample, awesome, we collect that. If they didn't, we are trying to produce minimal stress on these birds so we don't put them back in the bag. For the most part, most of them do give a fecal sample though. And so the goal there is to examine diet contents and get a better idea of what these guys are eating. So we are getting at a lot of those knowledge gaps that I mentioned earlier. And then throughout the year, we're also sampling vegetation in both random areas and areas that we have birds. And so this lets us know what they're using versus what they're not using. For these plots, we're looking at species composition. So what are the different types of vegetation there? What's the thickness and the height of the vegetation? What's the duff layer? I mentioned that is an important component for fire, and that's that layer of decayed organic material that accumulates. And then another component are clip plots. And so in a small area in the marsh, we're going in with little shears and cutting a couple centimeters above of the stems. And what that does is that helps us assess those railways by allowing us to look at the openness of the vegetation really at the bird's height where they're walking. And so we still have a full season left. We don't have any real results to share yet, but I do have some preliminary conclusions that I thought were important. And so the first one is, thankfully, the Florida Panhandle still seems to have a pretty strong population of black rails here. They do require those bunch grasses burned approximately every 2 to 5 years to reduce woody encroachment of shrubs and maintain those railways. Our detection rate is 20%, and that essentially is the probability that we're going to go out to one of our points on any given day. We have a 20% chance of detecting a rail. And across all those 115 points, about 15% of them are occupied by black rails. And so those ARUs, or those autonomous recording units, can be used to detect black rails successfully in remote areas where we're really not doing those traditional surveys. But it's important to note that the ARUs are not yet quite a substitute for traditional surveys, but they really can augment our ability to detect birds across a larger landscape. Based on call rates, the peak breeding season in our region appears to be from approximately mid-April through early to mid-July. And then this was really interesting to me, but when we started catching black rails in the winter, we weren't just catching one in an area. They were flushing out 2 and even 3 at a time, indicating that there's some degree of sociality. We're not really sure what that is, if these are just kind of adults hanging out in the same area, if it could be chicks from the previous year, if it could be birds that are mating up that early. Excuse me. And then, as we expected, the interannual site fidelity in the wintertime is low. We don't really know what it is in the breeding season because we're not at the point yet where people have banded them in the breeding season and came back to check on those bands in the breeding season. But I suspect it might be a little bit higher, but hopefully we'll do some work to find out more about that in the coming years. And so where is this all going? I mentioned that for a federal project, we have one more season of field work, but we did put in for a 5-year renewal and hopefully should hear back early next year or later this year to hear if we get approved to continue this work. In the meantime, this fall, we'll be working really hard to write up papers and recommendation documents and conduct workshops to share what we've learned. Something I'm personally really excited about is radio tracking these birds. And so this past winter, we conducted a pilot season to radio track black rails. And unfortunately, we had a bit of a low sample size, which is fine because it was the pilot season. And so what I'm hoping to do is to get a bunch more tags out in the next 2 years to look at things like home range, specifics for habitat selection, potentially nesting ecology, and identifying refugia for disturbances. And so if it can be done, I would love to track black rails when a prescribed burn is being implemented or when there's a king tide event to see where the birds are going. And so I think it's really important for black rail management. If there's some sort of buffer we need to be considering outside of the habitat that they're strictly using, if it turns out that the low marsh might be important for them to escape from fires, or if the uplands might be important for them to escape from extreme flooding. Excuse me. And what does this all mean in the context of conservation? And so again, I'd like to refer to the ACJV's Black Rail Conservation Plan because they really outlined this in a really detailed and easy to understand fashion. So if you're interested in anything black rail conservation wise, I definitely would recommend checking out this guidebook. But one of the items is to preserve and enhance current habitat through proper management. That's a pretty obvious one. But a big one's going to be creating new non-tidal habitat that will help provide refuge for coastal populations that are experiencing sea level rise. Promoting targeted impoundment management for things like that dense vegetation cover that they need, for areas with moist soil and shallow water to provide good foraging area, and then that micro topographical variation that we talked about too. Fire best management practices, or BMPs, should be developed to sort of outline the best ways that we can ignite fire, the best time of season to be initiating burns, proper return intervals, and the percentage of area that should not be burned to provide some refugia for the birds. And so one important aspect of rail ecology that we do know is after the breeding season, when birds are molting, they do have this completely flightless period. And so burning in late summer and early fall could cause direct mortality to birds. Developing best management practices for marsh migration, and this includes things like removal of snags in ghost forests, removal of invasive vegetation for species like Phragmites, adding in contoured slopes adjacent to existing marshes, and removing barriers that are really impeding that high marsh from migrating. And then developing landowner assurance programs. So a large portion of black rail habitat does occur on private property. And so landowners are going to be key in conservation and recovery of this species. However, some landowners may be reticent to undertake activities that support or attract federally listed species because they may be concerned about what restrictions that might cause on their properties. And so to address this concern, a landowner assurance program known as the Safe Harbor Act should be implemented to ensure that future property use limitations will not be required by Fish and Wildlife Services on this property. And Safe Harbor has been really successful with a lot of species, but I think a model example is the red cockaded woodpecker. It's really helped the species in the region, and it's helped a lot of landowners get on board with conserving their private lands for the benefit of that imperiled bird. And so last but not least, how do you go out and find a black rail, but do it ethically? Well, the first thing you would really want to understand is the preferred habitat. And you can do this by reading the literature and kind of scoping out areas without, trampling through them. Knowing not just that more common kikidoo call, but the other types of calls will help increase your chances of hearing one. Going out at the right time. So early in the morning near sunrise or late in the afternoon near sunset, and be prepared to wait, and also be prepared to be chewed up by mosquitoes and no-see-ums. If you do indeed detect one, just please use discretion when sharing observations, because the last thing the species needs, of course, is a bunch of people going out and using playback, which is actually illegal now that they've been listed, tramping around in the marsh and destroying the habitat, or potentially stepping on nests or adults. And please obviously do not approach a calling bird. All of these actions can cause undue stress on birds, and there have been documented examples of birds completely moving out of an area during the breeding season because people were using so much playback out there, it stressed them out too much. So that being said, spending a morning in the marsh, watching the sunrise and listening to these birds call is just an amazing way to start out the day. So with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you. That was really nice.
Yes, very good. And if you guys, Deborah, I think a lot of people had trouble hearing the call. I think Zoom did some crazy thing where it's hard for us to play calls now, but I think if Deborah, if you play it like you did the Merlin, I think that people were able to hear it.
I'm playing it now. Can you hear it? Heather, can you hear that?
No.
Okay, well, that was my theory anyway.
I could reenact it for you. It's kind of like a do or do.
No?
But if you go on if you just Google black rail call, there's several variations of that.
All right, any other questions? Elise said, it's an amazing presentation. Thanks so much. I only know the Virginia rail, so it was very fascinating.
Virginia rails are awesome. They're out in the marshes where we are too. And I always thought of Virginia rails as being pretty small until I saw them really close up. And they're actually, they're still small comparatively to something like a clapper rail, but then you get down to the black rail and it's just like minuscule.
Yes,
You
a
said
great job.
yellow rail was migratory?
The yellow rails are, yeah. So they just spend the winter here and then they go breed in way northern US and mostly in Canada.
I know there's a festival, Yellow Rail Festival.
Yeah, the Yellow Rails and Rice Festival. So Eric Johnson, who's giving a talk to you guys in a couple weeks, is one of the main people that runs that. And he's also on our project.